The problem isn't what you think it is. We are conditioned to believe that wealth is a complex labyrinth. A secret code written in the obscure language of Wall Street. Accessible only to those with the intellect of a mathematician and the ruthlessness of a shark. We think the barrier to entry is intelligence or luck. But the sensational truth at the heart of J.L. Collins's The Simple Path to Wealth is that the barrier is actually simplicity itself. The industry of finance, the brokers, the advisors, the pundits shouting on television, thrives on the myth of complexity. They need you to believe that investing is hard so that they can charge you fees to do it for you. Into this noisy, chaotic arena steps a father, J.L. Collins, not with a briefcase full of spreadsheets, but with a series of letters written to his daughter, Jessica. The narrative begins with a relatable, almost archetypal conflict, the obsessed father versus the reluctant daughter. Collins loved finance, he lived and breathed it. But Jessica, a vibrant young woman stepping into the world, told him bluntly, "Dad, I know money is important. I just don't want to spend my life thinking about it." This moment was the spark of a revolution. Collins realized that for his daughter, and for the millions of people who want to be free but don't want to be day traders, the solution had to be not just effective, but radically, painfully simple. It had to be a path that could be walked with one's eyes half shut. A strategy that required less effort than ordering a pizza, yet yielded the power of a king. The story ignites with the concept of "fu money." This is not a polite term. And it is not meant to be. It is the raw, visceral definition of what money actually buys. It does not buy Ferraris, it buys the sovereignty of the soul. Collins recounts a sensational moment from his own youth. He was a young professional, saving 50% of his income, driving a battered car, and living on the cheap. He wasn't rich by society's standards, but he had a fortress of cash in the bank. One day, his boss, a petty tyrant, demanded he apologize for a mistake he didn't make. The average man, tethered by debt and living paycheck to paycheck, would have swallowed his pride, bowed his head, and apologized to keep the lights on. But Collins was not the average man. He looked at his bank account, saw the "fu money," and realized he could survive for years without a paycheck. He looked the boss in the eye and said, "No." The sensation of that moment, the intoxicating rush of absolute freedom, was worth more than any luxury car ever manufactured. This narrative arc introduces the archetype of the freeman. The lesson is that money is a tool of liberation. When you spend money on stuff, you are trading your freedom for inventory. When you save money, you are buying options. The analysis of this stage reveals the psychology of the safety net. Fu money transforms the world from a place of threats into a place of opportunities. It allows you to take risks, to quit toxic jobs, and to sleep with the deep, untroubled breath of the free. As the narrative flows from the concept of freedom to the mechanics of lifestyle, we encounter the parable of the monk and the minister. Two childhood friends grow up and choose different paths. One becomes a high-ranking minister to the king, living in opulence but constantly bowing and scraping to the monarch's whims. The other becomes a monk, living in a mountain hut, eating nothing but plain rice and beans. One day, the minister visits the monk and says with pity, "My friend, if you could just learn to cater to the king, you wouldn't have to live on rice and beans." The monk smiles, looks at the minister, and replies, "My friend, if you could just learn to live on rice and beans, you wouldn't have to cater to the king." This story strikes at the heart of the consumption trap. The sensational truth is that your cost of living is the weight of the chains you wear. The minister is a slave to his lifestyle, and thus a slave to the king. The monk is free because his needs are few. Collins argues that the most powerful wealth-building tool is not a high income, but a high savings rate. The archetype of the super saver is not a person who deprives themselves, but a person who realizes that the joy of buying things is fleeting, while the joy of freedom is permanent. The psychological depth of this stage is the redefinition of enough. Once you realize that happiness does not scale with spending, you unlock the ability to save 50% of your income without feeling poor. You feel rich because you are buying your life back, 1 month at a time. The story then descends into the dungeon of debt. If Fu money is the hero of the story, debt is the dragon. Collins describes debt not as a financial tool, but as an emergency involving your hair being on fire. If your hair were on fire, you wouldn't ask, what is the most tax-efficient way to put this out? You would dunk your head in the toilet if you had to. You would do anything to extinguish the flames. That is how the seeker must treat high-interest consumer debt. The narrative exposes the siren song of the credit industry, which tries to normalize debt as a part of life. They sell you cashback and travel points to distract you from the 18% interest that is eating your future alive. The sensational reality is that borrowing money is mortgaging your future labor. When you buy a TV on a credit card, you are promising to work hours, days, or weeks in the future to pay for a piece of plastic that will be obsolete in 3 years. The simple path cannot begin until the dragon is slain. Collins advocates for a ruthless, violent aggression against debt. Every spare dollar, every side hustle, every sold item must go toward extinguishing the fire. The analysis here reveals the opportunity cost of interest. Every dollar paid in interest is a soldier that could have been working for you in the stock market. Recruiting more soldiers. Instead, you sent it to the bank to work for them. With the dragon slain and the fortress of FU money begun, the narrative shifts to the engine of wealth, the stock market. Here, Collins performs a sensational act of demystification. He strips away the terrifying jargon of derivatives, short selling, and candlestick charts. He reveals that the stock market is simply a grocery store of companies. When you buy a stock, you are buying a piece of a real business, a brewery, a software company, a shoe factory. These businesses have thousands of people working every day to solve problems and make profits. By owning a share, you get to sit back and collect a portion of those profits. But here is the twist. The archetype of the stock picker is a fool. Collins argues that trying to pick the winning company is like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Most professionals fail at it. Instead, the simple path warrior buys the entire haystack. This introduces the index fund, specifically the Total Stock Market Index Fund, VT-SAX. The narrative describes the sensation of ownership. Imagine walking through a mall or a city center. You look at the coffee shop, the tech store, the shipping trucks, and the banks. If you own the total market index, you own a piece of all of them. Every time someone buys a coffee, you get richer. Every time someone ships a package, you get richer. You are no longer just a consumer, you are an owner of the entire American economy. The psychological shift here is profound. You stop worrying about which company will go bankrupt because you know that while individual companies die, the market survives and adapts. If a bad company dies, it drops out of the index. If a new, great company rises, it enters the index. The index fund is a self-cleansing mechanism that ensures you always own the winners. But there is a catch. There is a price to pay for this infinite wealth machine. And it is not a fee in dollars. It is a fee in nerves. Collins introduces the great villain of the investing story, the crash. The market does not go up in a straight line. It crashes. It collapses. It dives by 30%, 40%, or 50%. The news anchors will scream that capitalism is ending. Your friends will sell in a panic. The simple path demands a stoic discipline that borders on the superhuman. The seeker must realize that the crash is not a bug, it is a feature. It is the admission price for the ride. Collins uses the metaphor of the market as a violent sea. If you are on a ship in a storm, the most dangerous thing you can do is jump overboard. You must lash yourself to the mast and wait. The market always recovers. It has recovered from world wars, pandemics, depressions, and terrorist attacks. The analysis of this stage reveals the psychology of the bear market. The investor loses money not when the market drops, but when they sell while it is down. If you hold, your loss is merely paper. If you sell, you make the loss real. The simple path is simple, but it is not easy. It requires the temperament of a monk amidst the panic of the mob. The narrative momentum builds as Collins addresses the cult of the advisor. He warns the seeker that the financial industry is designed to extract wealth, not create it. He reveals the tyranny of the expense ratio. A 1% fee sounds small, almost negligible, but over a lifetime of compounding, that 1% can consume 30% to 50% of your total wealth. It is a parasitic leak in your fuel tank. The archetype of the self-reliant investor rejects the advisor. They realize that no one cares about their money more than they do. By buying a low-cost index fund like VT Sachs with an expense ratio of 0.04%, they keep the wealth for themselves. This is the sensation of efficiency. The seeker is now running a lean, mean, wealth-building machine. They earn money. They save half of it, the monk. They pay off debt, the dragon slayer. And they pour the rest into the total stock market, the owner. Refusing to pay fees to advisors, the parasite removal. The first 10,000 characters have laid the foundation of the philosophy. We have moved from the daughter's reluctance to the father's solution. We have established that money is freedom, fu money. That spending is slavery, the minister. And that the market is a powerful but volatile engine, the sea. The seeker stands on the precipice of the accumulation phase, armed with the knowledge that the path is simple, but the journey is long. The air is thick with the realization that the greatest enemy is not the economy, but one's own behavior. The path is set. The index fund is selected. And the seeker is now ready to descend into the deeper mechanics of asset allocation, the stages of life, and the ultimate endgame of the withdrawal phase. The story continues, intensifying toward the dramatic realization that wealth is mathematical inevitability if, and only if, you can master your own mind. The narrative momentum shifts from the acquisition of assets to the architecture of the portfolio. We are overlooking the detail that while the stock market is the engine of wealth, it is an engine that vibrates with terrifying violence. To survive the journey without being shaken to pieces, the seeker may eventually need shock absorbers. Collins introduces the second character in the investment drama, bonds. If stocks are the wild stallion that runs fast but occasionally bucks you off, bonds are the steady ox. They are boring, they are slow, but they smooth out the ride. The narrative explains that during the accumulation phase, when the seeker is young, working, and pouring money into the pot, they do not need the ox. They need the stallion. Collins argues for a sensational, 100% stock portfolio, VT Sachs, for those building wealth. Why? Because when the market crashes, the accumulator is actually buying shares on sale. The volatility is their friend. The risk of stocks is irrelevant to someone who isn't selling for 30 years. The analysis of this stage reveals the paradox of volatility. The more volatile the asset class, the higher the long-term returns. By adding bonds too early, the young investor is essentially paying insurance premiums against a crash that doesn't hurt them anyway. But as the seeker approaches the summit of independence, the narrative changes. The preservation phase begins. Now, the seeker is no longer earning a paycheck, they are living off their portfolio. A 50% crash is no longer a sale, it is a catastrophe that destroys their grocery money. Here, Collins introduces the simple portfolio mix, stocks, VT Sachs, for growth and inflation protection, and bonds, VBTLX, total bond market index, for stability and deflation protection. The archetype of the balanced steward might hold 75% in stocks and 25% in bonds. The sensational mechanism here is rebalancing. When stocks soar, the steward sells some expensive stocks to buy cheap bonds. When stocks crash, the steward sells stable bonds to buy cheap stocks. This automatic process forces the investor to buy low and sell high, without ever having to make a prediction. The bonds act as a deflationary shield, ensuring that even in a deep recession, there is cash available to pay the bills without having to sell stocks at the bottom. The story then dives into the great debate of entry, lump sum versus dollar cost averaging. Imagine a seeker who inherits a large sum of money or sells a business. They are standing on the shore with a mountain of cash, terrified of the violent sea. Their instinct is to dip their toe in, investing a little bit each month to be safe. This is dollar cost averaging. Collins attacks this instinct with the cold steel of math. He reveals that because the market goes up more often than it goes down, waiting to invest is statistically a losing bet. You are betting that the market will drop. while history says it will likely rise. The lump sum investor, who dumps it all in at once, wins about 75% of the time. However, the narrative acknowledges the psychological truce. If dumping it all in makes you so anxious that you will panic and sell at the first drop, then dollar cost averaging is acceptable as a sleep aid. The analysis reveals that math is the map, but psychology is the terrain. The best strategy is the one that prevents you from abandoning the path. The flow carries us to the siren song of real estate. In the pantheon of American wealth, real estate is often worshipped as the supreme god. Collins plays the role of the iconoclast. He argues that for most people, a house is a liability masquerading as an asset. He deconstructs the American dream of homeownership with brutal efficiency. He lists the silent killers of real estate returns, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, WA fees, and the massive opportunity cost of the down payment. While your money is trapped in drywall and shingles, it is not growing in the VT Sachs factory. He posits that real estate is not an investment, it is a second job. You have to fix toilets, deal with tenants, and navigate zoning laws. The simple path is about freedom, and being a landlord is the opposite of freedom. The seeker learns to view a home as a lifestyle choice, a place to live and make memories, but not the engine of their financial independence. The sensational freedom of renting is reclaimed. The renter knows exactly what their housing costs are, while the owner only knows the asterisk minimum they will pay. The narrative intensity builds as we approach the endgame, the 4% rule. This is the mathematical heart of the preservation phase. How do you know when you have enough FU money to quit your job forever? Collins points to the Trinity study, a famous piece of financial research. The sensational conclusion is that if you withdraw 4% of your portfolio in the first year and adjust for inflation thereafter, you have a 95% chance of your money lasting 30 years or more. This gives the seeker a concrete finish line. To find their freedom number, they simply take their annual spending and multiply it by 25. If you spend $40 a year, you need $1.000. When the account hits that number, the chains fall off. The psychological depth of this stage is the concretization of the dream. Freedom is no longer a vague hope, it is a math problem. Every dollar saved brings the finish line closer. The seeker realizes that they can buy their life for 25 times their annual expenses. But Collins adds a critical nuance to the 4% rule: flexibility. The archetype of the rigid robot follows the rule blindly, selling stocks even when the market is down 50% just to get their cash. This leads to ruin. The flexible freeman adjusts. If the market crashes, they tighten their belt. They skip the vacation. They eat out less. They spend only 3%. By simply adjusting their spending during the storms, they ensure their portfolio survives to see the sunshine. This analyzes the resilience of the variable spender. The seeker learns that the 4% rule is a guideline, not a law. The ultimate safety net is not the money itself, but the seeker's ability to adapt. The story shifts to the Social Security and pension puzzle. Collins treats these not as the foundation of retirement, but as the cherry on top. The simple path warrior builds a portfolio that can sustain them without government help. When Social Security kicks in, it is merely extra gravy or an inflation hedge. This mindset protects the seeker from the political uncertainty of government programs. The narrative encourages a self-reliant sovereignty. By assuming no one is coming to save you, you save yourself, and if help does arrive, it is a pleasant surprise, not a desperate necessity. The momentum carries us into the tax optimization labyrinth. While Collins preaches simplicity, he acknowledges that the government wants its cut. He introduces the 3 buckets of taxation: tax now, brokerage accounts; tax deferred, 401k, IRA; and tax-free, Roth IRA. The sensational strategy is to fill the buckets in a specific order to minimize the friction of taxes. The seeker learns to prioritize the employer match, free money, then the tax-advantaged accounts, and finally the taxable accounts. The psychological lesson is, don't let the tax tail wag the investment dog. You invest to make money. not just to avoid taxes. But a tax-efficient portfolio grows faster because the friction of the state is reduced. The narrative approaches the behavioral gauntlet. The math of the simple path is easy: save 50%. By V.T. Sachs. Wait, but the asterisk doing is agonizingly hard because of the noise. Collins describes the financial news media as a carnival of fear. Their job is not to inform you, it is to glue your eyes to the screen so they can sell ads. To do that, they must constantly terrify you with predictions of doom. The archetype of the information dieter ignores the news completely. They realize that market news is noise. But market history is signal. History says the market goes up. News says it might go down tomorrow. The seeker chooses history. The sensation of detachment allows the seeker to walk through a market crash with a smile, knowing that they are accumulating shares, while others are vaporizing wealth. The story then addresses the charitable spirit. Once the seeker has achieved FU money, a new question arises. What is it all for? Collins argues that wealth creates a responsibility to give back. But he applies the same rigorous thinking to charity as he does to investing. He warns against ineffective altruism. The seeker learns to look for high-impact giving, ensuring that their dollars are actually solving problems, not just paying for administrative overhead. This is the sensation of philanthropic efficiency. The simple path leads not just to personal freedom, but to the power to effect change in the world. The giant within is now a benefactor, using their surplus to lift others. As the second part concludes, the seeker has built the engine, V.T. Sachs, installed the shock absorbers, bonds, defined the destination, 25x expenses, and learned to ignore the sirens, media, real estate. The simple portfolio is constructed. It is a fortress of solitude in a chaotic financial world. But the journey is not over. The final challenge is not mathematical, it is existential. What happens when you actually cross the finish line? What is the meaning of a life when you no longer have to work? And how do you pass this wisdom on to the next generation without spoiling them? The story prepares to descend into the final integration of wealth and meaning, and the ultimate legacy of the simple path. The air is thick with the realization that money is solved, but life is just beginning. The narrative flows into the existential void of the finish line. We are overlooking the most important thing. Reaching financial independence is not the end of the movie, it is merely the end of the prologue. The seeker, having spent decades in the trenches of the accumulation phase, battling the dragon of debt and building the fortress of V.T. Sachs, now stands at the summit. But instead of euphoria, they often feel a sensational vertigo of purpose. The archetype of the worker bee has defined their identity for so long that without the queen, the employer, to serve, they feel lost. Collins addresses the one more year syndrome, the terrifying addiction to accumulation. The seeker has enough money, but the fear of the unknown drives them to work just one more year for a safety buffer they do not need. The narrative warns that this is a trap. Time is the only non-renewable resource. Trading a year of your healthy, vibrant life for a pile of gold you will never spend is the ultimate bad trade. The simple path demands the courage to pull the plug. The seeker must transition from being a creator of wealth to a creator of life. The analysis here reveals the vacuum of freedom. Freedom is terrifying because it requires you to define your own existence. The giant within must now answer the question, who am I when I am not producing economic value? The story then shifts to the legacy of the Bank of Dad. How does the simple path warrior pass this wisdom to the next generation without creating a trust fund brat? Collins recounts the sensational experiment he conducted with his daughter, Jessica. He realized that you cannot lecture a child about compounding, they must feel it. So, he established the Bank of Dad. When Jessica was young, for every dollar she saved from her allowance or odd jobs, the Bank of Dad paid her a staggering, non-market interest rate, sometimes 50% per month. The narrative describes the sensation of the magic machine. Jessica watched her money multiply like rabbits. She learned viscerally that money makes money. When she eventually spent some, she felt the pain not of the lost cash, but of the lost earning power. This effectively wired her brain for the simple path before she even understood what a stock market was. The psychological lesson is the gamification of thrift. By creating a microeconomy in the home, the parent transforms saving from a chore into a power-up. The child learns that capital is not for hoarding, it is a living worker that must be treated with respect. The momentum carries us to the philosophy of optimism. Why does the simple path work? Why does the market always go up in the long run? Is it magic? Collins argues that it is something far more profound. It is human ingenuity. The archetype of the rational optimist bets on the market because they are betting on the collective problem-solving ability of the human species. When a crisis hits, a pandemic, a war, a resource shortage, humans do not just roll over and die. They innovate. They build better machines, faster vaccines, and cleaner energy. The stock market is simply the scorecard of human progress. The seeker learns that being a perma-bear, permanent pessimist, is a losing strategy because it bets against the survival instinct of humanity. The sensational truth is that while the world is noisy and scary in the short term, the arc of history bends toward improvement. The simple path is fundamentally a vote of confidence in our future. The analysis reveals that cynicism is expensive. The optimist gets rich because they provide the capital for the future to be built. The pessimist stays poor because they are hoarding canned food in a bunker waiting for an end that never comes. The narrative approaches the gathering of the tribe. Collins describes the phenomenon of the Chautauqua retreats where adherents of the financial independence (FI) movement gather. This highlights the loneliness of the long-distance saver. Following the simple path makes you a social deviant, while your neighbors are financing new SUVs and complaining about their jobs. You are driving a 10-year-old sedan and planning your exit. The archetype of the alienated sovereign needs a community. The seeker realizes that wealth is not just numbers, it is shared values. Finding others who value time over things validates the journey and provides the social proof necessary to stay the course when the consumer culture screams, buy, buy, buy. The lesson is that you cannot walk the path alone. You need kindred spirits to remind you that the emperor of consumerism has no clothes. The story flows into the nuance of the international investor. While the book focuses on the U.S. market, VT Sachs, the narrative acknowledges the global seeker. The principles, high savings rate, low fees, broad diversification, are universal laws. Like gravity, whether you are in Europe, Asia, or Australia, the simple path remains the same. Even if the specific ticker symbols change, the seeker learns to look for the total market index of their own region or a global all-cap index, like VT. The sensational realization is that the math of wealth transcends borders. The giant of the simple path speaks every language. The narrative intensity builds toward the final synthesis. The seeker looks back at the journey. They see the complex industrial complex of Wall Street for what it is, a theater of smoke and mirrors designed to transfer wealth from the client to the broker. They see the simple path not as a get-rich-quick scheme, but as a get-rich-sure path. It is boring. It is unsexy. It requires the patience of a stone and the discipline of a monk. But it works. The seeker realizes that the boredom was the point. By automating their wealth, they freed their mind to focus on the things that actually matter: family, creativity, health, and nature. The stock market was never the destination, it was just the engine room in the basement that kept the lights on in the cathedral of life. The climax of the journey is the state of unshakable peace. The seeker has achieved FU money. They walk into a room and know that they can speak their truth without fear of retribution. They wake up on a Tuesday morning and realize the day belongs entirely to them. They have stepped off the hedonic treadmill and are walking on solid ground. The giant within is no longer hungry, no longer fearful, and no longer driven by the whip of necessity. The giant is calm. The final sensation is the lightness of being. The complicated knots of financial anxiety have been untied, leaving a straight, simple line stretching into a horizon of infinite possibility. Analyze the ultimate meaning that the book intends to convey. The simple path to wealth is a manifesto for liberty through simplicity. J. L. Collins's core message is that complexity is the enemy of execution. The financial industry wants you to believe you need a PhD to manage money so they can harvest your wealth. Collins proves that a high school dropout, with a savings rate of 50% and a single index fund, will outperform a Wall Street professional with a complex strategy and high fees. The book serves as a declaration of independence from the consumer culture that enslaves us and the financial industry that exploits us. The final lesson is one of life design. Money is not the goal. Money is the fuel. The goal is to have the freedom to spend your limited time on this earth doing what makes your soul sing. The journey ends with the realization that the path was never hidden, it was just obscured by the noise of those who profit from your confusion. You have cleared the brush, paved the road, and now, with a backpack full of VT sacks and a heart full of courage, you simply have to keep walking. The view from the top is worth every step. The simple path is not about the money, it is about the freedom the money buys.